Everybody hear me okay? Oh, okay. Hi, I'm Eryn McGrath, as you guys have heard, very new Assistant State Veterinarian. And I'm going to be talking to you today about New World Screwworm, which fortunately is not nearly as complicated of an issue as high-path AI is, but is an emerging problem that we do need to be aware about. And as Maggie alluded to, if you are not already aware, this is essentially a flesh-eating maggot. Let's see if I can work this. Oh, okay. So this is a zoonotic pest, meaning it can infect any warm-blooded mammal, including people, unfortunately. And what sets us apart from other species of maggot is that it feeds on living tissue, whereas other maggots, just push buttons. Other maggots have only eat dead or decaying flesh. So this can cause really extensive tissue damage and can potentially be life-threatening. It is endemic to South America and areas of Central America, really prefers a tropical, subtropical to temperate climate. The US did eradicate screwworm in 1966 with the use of a sterile insect technique, which I'll get into a little bit later. But because of its persistence in Mexico, we did still experience outbreaks well into the 1970s. And this did prompt collaboration between the US and Mexico to push screwworm populations back into southern Mexico by 1986. Let's see if I can work this. So these little guys here are the culprits. Full grown, they're about 3/4 of an inch long. They do have rows of spines around their body that give them that characteristic screw-like appearance. And they have little hook-like mouth parts, and that's what they tear through tissue with. They do have a weather-dependent life cycle, so they are killed by freezing temperatures, and then they have a slower life cycle in cooler temperatures and a faster life cycle in warmer temperatures. In optimal conditions, their life cycle can be as short as about 21 to 24 days, so their populations really can multiply quite rapidly. So who's at risk? Essentially, any animal that has a wound or has recently had surgery. And these wounds can actually be as small as a tick bite, so it really doesn't take much. The flies are also attracted to laying eggs in normal body orifices, so eyes, ears, mouth, nose, and for whatever reason, they're particularly attracted to the newborn umbilicus as well. So I talked about, or briefly touched on the sterile insect technique. This is a rather brilliant technique that actually was developed in the 1950s and involves the strategic release of irradiated sterile male flies. And these sterile male flies will seek out and breed with the natural fertile female flies. And this union results in unviable eggs. And what's key to this being successful is that those female flies typically only mate once in their lifetime. So the natural fly populations can actually be wiped out in only a few life cycles, which, as I talked about, can be relatively short in those optimal conditions. So this technique is what has been used to maintain what we call a biological barrier in Panama to keep those populations at bay. And that's been maintained by the Panama United States Commission for the Eradication and Prevention of Screwworm. It's a bit of a mouthful, also known as COPEG. So a little background information, and I don't know what happened to my image there, but that was an affected deer. But just to talk about some previous outbreaks that the U.S. has experienced, biggest outbreak was in 1972 and was due to northern migration of animals and flies during optimal weather conditions from Mexico. And multiple U.S. states were affected. Texas in particular was hit quite heavily. They had 90,000 cases that year, whereas the year prior they'd been under 500 cases. And this cost the southern U.S. livestock industry $372 million for that single outbreak. Florida in 2016 had a much smaller scale outbreak affecting their endangered key deer population. 136 deers were involved, 9 domestic animals, no livestock during this outbreak. And despite this being on a much smaller scale, it was still very impactful. That endangered key deer population was reduced by 15%, and it still cost $3.2 million in eradication efforts. So again, just kind of driving home exactly how costly this can be. In 1957, the Southeast livestock industry was estimating about $20 million in losses annually due to screwworm alone. And in 1960, the Southwest livestock industry was estimating around $100 million of annual losses due to screwworm. And then another outbreak in 1976 cost, with just eradication funds alone, $15 million. This is an interesting chart, and this is touching on that 1976 outbreak, which wasn't quite as big as that 1972 outbreak, but was still fairly large. And see if I can get the pointer to work. So what's interesting about this is we do have some inflation adjustments to kind of give a little bit of an idea if we had one of these outbreaks today in more modern times, exactly how costly it would be to us. So we're primarily looking at the bottom two rows here, so Texas producer losses and the Texas economy losses, but just to highlight a couple key things. So 1976 was about $329 million of economy losses to Texas in total. If that had happened last year in 2024, we'd have been looking at over $1.8 billion. So incredibly costly. Open. One of my images also had a formatting issue. But why is this relevant to us today? Because unfortunately, that biological barrier has been breached. As of 2023, we have seen an explosion of cases moving north of that biological barrier in Panama. And that's what the image to your right was supposed to be. There was a little pink line there that was indicating where that barrier is, but it's just below all these colored dots here, right about there. And all of these colored dots do represent those cases that have since moved north of that barrier. And as of mid-January, we've seen 3 cases as far north as Mexico, unfortunately. Okay, so why does this matter to us here in Colorado? Unfortunately, we are not isolated from this. A threat to the U.S. is a threat to Colorado. And while we're not a border state, we do work very closely with many border states, Texas in particular, which, as I've talked about, has been heavily impacted by this in the past. And while I've touched on how costly this can be, there are other things to consider. So surviving affected animals might have damaged or disfigured hides, which can reduce their values. Also having to contend with significant management changes that have to be made, animal movement restrictions, and even loss of things like hunting lease revenue because wildlife are impacted by this as well. Sorry, I don't know what's happening with all of my pictures. But what are we looking for? Yeah, they were pretty gross. My son looked at my presentation last night and had a few words about it. So affected animals often will act irritated, agitated, they might be depressed, they might separate from the herd, go off of their feed, have decreased milk production. You'll obviously want to be looking out for any animals with wounds, particularly infected, odoriferous, enlarging wounds, and of course any wounds that have maggots in them. These maggots might not actually be as apparent as you would expect. Because they feed off of living tissue, they do tend to burrow deep into those wounds. So really closely inspecting that deeper wound bed is very important. And also these wounds can be inhabited by more than one species of maggot. So if you do have an infected wound and you're sampling it for testing, ensuring you're getting multiple samples of multiple maggots within that wound. So you get a fully representative sample of what actually is inhabiting that wound. And so if screwworm is there, it will be identified. The female eggs also lay their egg masses in a characteristic shingle-like appearance, which is what the picture down in my left-hand corner was supposed to indicate. But just another thing that you can keep an eye out for, because that can be apparent or visible on wound edges. So what do we do to prevent this? Surveillance is really key for prevention. So being vigilant, knowing what we're looking for, trying to identify this as early as possible so that we can intervene as early as possible. Also, inspecting any animals moving internationally, closely inspecting any vehicles moving to and from affected areas, and controlling animal movements, because that is how this is spread. And that also involves trying to limit wildlife movement as much as possible too, so prohibiting hunting in affected areas. And then changes in management practices, eliminating wounding procedures to make your herd less vulnerable to this. There is no specific treatment for screwworm. Treatment involves quarantine, so separating affected animals from unaffected animals, and then general supportive care, so wound care, treating secondary bacterial infections, pain management, and then physical removal and destruction of those larvae, remembering to keep some for testing. So what are we doing about this? Multiple U.S. agencies are partnering and also working with governments of affected countries to try and halt this northern progression of screwworm. APHIS has invested almost $110 million towards these efforts, and these efforts do hinge on 3 key strategies. So increasing outreach and education, again, so that we can stay vigilant, improving our surveillance efforts, and then restriction of animal movements, and also the use of the sterile insect technique. So COPED can ramp up production of their sterile flies to 100 million flies a week during an outbreak, which is quite impressive. So actively, our ultimate goal is to try and reestablish that barrier down in Panama. Currently, we're trying to establish a goal coast to coast across Mexico, just north of where those current cases have been identified, to stop that northern progression. And then once that's achieved, we'll be attempting to push those populations back again behind that original barrier in Panama. Part of what is being done to create this new barrier is construction of several of the sterile fly production plants within Mexico itself so that the sterile fly production can be ramped up even further. So there are currently import restrictions in place. In November of 2024, actually all ruminant products, so including cattle and bison, were banned from Mexico being imported into the US. That ban has since been lifted as of the 1st of this month, and now cattle and bison can be again imported into the US, but have to meet certain criteria. APHIS and Mexico did collaborate and have created comprehensive clearance, inspection, and treatment protocols that must be met for that importation. And there are some restrictions on other animals, so dogs and horses, but full regulations and restrictions can be found on APHIS's website. So this is a reportable disease. If you think you have a case of screwworm or you have an animal with maggot-infested wounds, this does have to be reported. Ideally collaborating with an accredited veterinarian, but if you don't have an established relationship with one, APHIS does have a handy search engine where you can find one. But ultimately, you yourself or your veterinarian do need to report this to the area veterinarian in charge or the state animal health official. And their information also can be found on APHIS's website. I think that's all I have for you. Oh, yep. Any questions on flesh-eating maggots? Yes. It does, yes. So Colorado has had less of an issue with that, and most of the Midwest has. It's been more of an issue for our southern states that don't reach those freezing temperatures prior to eradication in 1966. But that's one of the issues that's faced by South America and Central America is it doesn't die off with freezing temperatures in the winter, so it overwinters for them. That's a great question. I'm not sure on that. Maggie, do you know? Yeah, not sure.
It is something that we are aware of and concerned about with, we've seen an increase in vectors here in Colorado because we don't have quite as cold and quite as long of freezes some winters. So this is, something that we have to keep an eye on. So we'll look and see if they have an established time and temperature for how long it's supposed to keep freezing.
Anything else? Oh, yep. Sorry, I didn't hear that.
Ivermectin. Is ivermectin?
Oh, yes, it is. Yep, ivermectin is effective against it. And APHIS actually has a full list of all insecticides that are effective against it as well.
And for our presentation next year, we'll try to bring something happier, okay? Flesh-eating maggots and everybody's exact
And HPAI. Okay. Yep. All right, thank you for having me.
Help me thank Dr. Baldwin and Dr. McGrath. Thank you.